This video was brought to you by our podcast, Truss Issues. It's been a tough couple of weeks for Liz Truss. Her first big policy announcement as Prime Minister spooked the financial markets, forcing the pound to historic lows and driving up the government's borrowing costs. Her first round of media interviews since, given to local radio stations across the country on Thursday, went equally badly. And polling suggests that Labour are on track to win a massive outright majority at the next general election. So in this video, we're going to ask whether Truss can survive the next couple of months, and what she might do next to save her skin, and how much longer Conservative MPs are even going to tolerate these sorts of results. So let's start with a quick recap. Throughout her campaign, Truss made it clear that she wanted to focus on growth, even if that meant higher borrowing in the short term. She explicitly committed to reversing Boris Johnson's national insurance rise, which was supposed to pay for new social care spending. Truss also promised to scrap the proposed corporation tax rise, which was supposed to rise from 19% to 25% in April. These were already pretty significant tax cuts, but when the new Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng announced his so-called mini-budget on Friday, it also included a cut to the top rate of income tax from 45% to 40%, a cut to the basic rate of income tax from 20% to 19%, and a cut to stamp duty, which is payable on the purchase of a house. To afford all these extra tax cuts, and their promise to cap energy prices at the equivalent of £2,500 for the average annual household energy consumption, the government was going to have to borrow a lot of money. Now, Truss's argument here is that while the government might have to borrow a fair bit in the next couple of years, in the long term these policies will pay for themselves by stimulating growth and therefore increasing total tax receipts. Unfortunately, the international markets weren't convinced by Truss's argument. On Friday, after Kwarteng's announcement, investors dumped both the pound and UK government bonds, forcing up the government's borrowing costs. The pound touched a 40-year low against the dollar of $1.03, and the yield on the government's 10-year bond jumped to nearly 4.5%. For context, that means yields jumped about 1.5% in a couple of days, representing the sharpest increase since records began, and adding roughly £15 billion to the government's annual borrowing costs. Anyway, this rapid increase in gilt yields played havoc with the financial markets. You don't really have to understand the specifics here, but the basic idea is that the UK bond market, or the gilt market, is dominated by pension funds. The chaos in the market created a negative feedback loop, which risked bankrupting a whole load of pension funds, forcing the Bank of England to intervene by buying tons of gilts. This is pretty unprecedented. The Bank of England usually intervenes in response to some sort of international crisis, like the 2008 financial crash or COVID, not the government's own budget. Anyway, through all of this, Truss and Kwarteng essentially hid from the media. Truss finally did her first round of media interviews on Thursday morning, nearly a week after the budget. And, well, things didn't go well.
Time is short, so I'm going to just blaze on into the questions. Lots from my listeners this morning. Carrie in Birchington says, "What on earth were you thinking? The country was already in a state of recession." Another says, "How can we ever trust the Conservatives with our economy again?" And Lydia says, "Are you ashamed of what you've done? Are you?"
The pound has dropped to a record low. The IMF has said that you should reevaluate your policies, and the Bank of England has had to spend £65 billion to prop up the markets because of what they describe as a material risk. Where have you been?
We've also taken action to reduce our tax burden and spur.
Yeah, but Prime Minister, with respect, that is the same scripted answer you've given to every BBC local radio station this morning. You've got the Bank of England stepping in now to try and clean up a mess a government has caused. That has never happened.
Then on Thursday afternoon, the first post-budget polls started to come out. And, well, they were pretty terrible for Truss, giving Labour somewhere between a 17 and 33 point lead. On top of this, basically every poll had the Conservatives and Liz Truss behind on economic competence, and Starmer with a healthy lead over Truss over who would make the best Prime Minister. Things got even worse for Truss at the Conservative Party conference, which was held over the weekend. Neither Rishi Sunak nor Boris Johnson turned up, presumably to avoid being associated with Truss's government, and on Saturday, Michael Gove told the BBC at conference that the 45p tax cut was a, quote, display of the wrong values. Roughly a dozen Conservative MPs then said they wouldn't be voting for the cut in the Commons, despite the government threatening to remove the whip if they did so. The government finally U-turned on Monday morning, when Kwasi Kwarteng released a statement claiming the government had listened and that the 45p cut had become, quote, a distraction. While this might have saved Truss some face in the short term, such a screeching U-turn is embarrassing and will make it harder for Truss to get her more controversial policies through in the future. So, what happens next? Well, the pound has since recovered, which is good news because an immediate currency crisis now looks very unlikely. However, things still don't look very good for Truss. The 45p tax rate U-turn only saved the government about £2 billion, and the markets have made it clear that they don't like the government's plans. Similarly, the Bank of England has made it clear that they don't want to keep buying government bonds forever. This means that the government will probably have to either raise taxes or cut spending to afford their current plans, and in the last couple of days, they've made it clear that they'd prefer to cut spending. On Monday morning, Kwasi Kwarteng told BBC Radio 4 that public service spending would not rise in line with inflation, amounting to a real terms cut of roughly £18 billion, according to the IFS. In a similar vein, Conservative Party Chair Simon Clarke said that the UK had a, quote, very large welfare state and that the government wanted to, quote, trim the fat off public services to keep spending down. This has already gone down pretty badly with a whole load of Tory MPs, including former Work and Pension Secretary Stephen Crabb and Nadine Dorries, who's called for a general election. Clearly, Truss is quickly losing control of her party, and it's hard to see how she'll survive until the next general election. So, Truss is in a very difficult position, and just days into her premiership, it looks possible she's already being pushed out. If you want to know more about this, we discuss the odds of Truss making it to the next election in the latest episode of our podcast, Truss Issues. We also run through her 9 biggest policy promises and see if she's actually been able to achieve anything else she's committed to, despite this chaos. You can watch that over on our TLDR podcast YouTube channel, which is linked below, or you can just search for it in your favourite podcast app. Thanks for your support.